In 1758, 300 Comanche warriors stormed the San Saba mission, torched the stockade, and left 19 Spanish settlers dead in the dust, their screams swallowed by the Texas wind. By 1874, the U.S. Army answered back, burning 1,400 horses at Palo Duro Canyon, forcing 7,200 Comanche onto a shrinking Oklahoma reservation. "Everything you see and everything you saw yesterday is my home," a warrior once boasted, but that home shrank fast. Today, 15,000 carry the Comanche name, their flag snapping over Lawton. In 2025, how did a nation of raiders who turned horses into gold and Nole into profit bend but not break under centuries of war? The Comanche ran the Great Plains for centuries, their grip solid until the U.S. cracked it in the 1870s. Today, in 2025, the Comanche Nation counts around 15,000 members, many still tied to rules laid down 300 years back. They never stayed put, roaming from what's now Colorado to Texas in bands of 50 or 100, lugging teepees and tracking buffalo. That kept them untouchable. Spanish scouts in the 1700s scribbled frustrated notes about chasing ghosts across the grass. Settling down wasn't their style, not until the U.S. Army rolled in. After 1865, with the Civil War done, Washington had spare troops and a itch to push west. By the 1870s, soldiers herded the Comanche onto Oklahoma reservations. Over 7,000 were boxed in by 1880, per census rolls. No more open plains, just fences and rations. Their old strength came from never sitting still. A standing camp was a target, and they knew it. Some say they should have built villages like the Cherokee, but that's a stretch. Walls wouldn't have stopped the U.S., just made the end come faster. Now their tribal office in Lawton hums along, a sign that 1875 didn't wipe them out, only pinned them down. The Comanche outmatched the Apache, who held the southern plains from the 1720s to the 1750s. The Apache worked fields near the Rio Grande, their villages of 200 or 300 people rooted to corn and squash patches. Comanche bands swept in, 50 or 100 strong, hitting a settlement at dusk, grabbing horses and goods, then bolting before dawn. They didn't plant or build. Why bother when they could take what they needed and keep moving? That approach rattled outsiders too. Spanish soldiers marched from Mexico City in the 1770s, aiming to smash the Comanche. In 1779, Governor Juan Bautista de Anza led 600 men north, ambushed a camp, and killed a chief near modern Colorado. The raids rolled on anyway. After Mexico won independence in 1821, its army, strapped for cash and men, lost ground faster. Comanche struck San Antonio in 1825, hauling off livestock and 200 captives per colonial logs. Moving constantly didn't just mean fighting smart. They traded too, lugging buffalo hides to French outposts in East Texas, bartering for knives and powder, and darker still, selling off Apache prisoners to Spanish settlers or rival tribes. The Apache's farms pinned them down. Excavations show their adobe homes burned out by 1750. Could the Comanche have lasted longer with walls? Doubtful. Spain's forts crumbled under the same hit-and-run pressure. Mexico's garrisons, down to 1,500 troops by 1824, couldn't hold the line either. Speed trumped stability, though it leaned hard on steady loot and weather. The Comanche made it work while it lasted. The Comanche got the better of the Apache, who held the southern plains from the 1720s to the 1750s. The Apache stuck to their farms along the San Antonio River, growing maize to feed villages of 200 or 250 people. Comanche bands, 50 or 80 at a time, raced in at sundown, torched a grain stash, nabbed a dozen horses, and took off before anyone could muster a counterattack. They never bothered with crops of their own. Hitting and running kept them fed. That method threw off foreign enemies too. Spanish troops slogged up from Mexico City in the 1770s, ordered to put the Comanche down. In 1779, Governor Juan Bautista de Anza mustered 600 men, caught a band near the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and cut down a leader, but Comanche struck Santa Fe again by fall. Mexico broke free in 1821, yet its northern garrisons, barely 1,200 soldiers strong by 1825 per official tallies, watched towns like Durango lose 300 head of cattle in a single 1824 raid. Comanche didn't just fight, they traded, carting hides to French camps near the Red River and handing over Apache captives to Spanish buyers in Texas. Horses sealed their edge. By the late 1690s, they'd turned riding into an art, sparked by the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. That August, Pueblo warriors in New Mexico chased Spanish settlers out, leaving 400 horses behind according to mission logs. Comanche bands bartered for those animals, moved south from Colorado around 1700, and started roping Mustangs across the Llano Estacado, building herds up to 1,500 some years. The Apache's fields left them wide open. Spain's forts, often manned by just 200, cracked under the onslaught. Horses gave them speed and reach, though a harsh winter could drop half a herd. The Comanche played that card and ruled the plains. The Apache vanished from the southern plains by 1750, and French colonists in Louisiana pressed for horses, buffalo hides, and meat. Comanche bands of 50 or 100 riders pulled up to trading posts near Natchitoches, unloaded piles of hides, drove in strings of 20 horses, and traded for muskets and pots from Europe. They bartered with northern tribes too, like the Wichita, swapping 30 Mustangs for furs carried down from British Columbia outposts. According to French notes from 1748, horses were their currency. A young man might wrestle one from the Texas grasslands in 3 days, or slip it from a Mexican corral under moonlight. They traded people too. Comanche started with Apache captives, selling them off in New Spain, then pushed into Mexico after 1700, grabbing settlers and their African-descended slaves during raids on towns like Coahuila, where 200 disappeared in 1746, per Spanish records. Buyers needed workers for ranches and mines, and Comanche cashed in. Ethics aside, their approach to the Apache was clear. Take them all out. At midnight, 60 warriors stormed a camp near the Saba River, slashed cattle necks, set fire to corn heaps, and left the place in ashes. By midday, they charged again, hacked down 20 men in a 1749 fight, per mission accounts, and herded women and kids off for sale. If no one bought, they killed them on the spot, blood soaking the dirt. It worked. Apache stragglers, maybe 300 left by 1750 per tribal counts, scattered west to New Mexico or south across the Rio Grande. The Comanche didn't just outrun them, they broke them with slaughter and sales. Some argue that living off raids left them vulnerable to lean years, but Apache villages, 80% torched by mid-century per dig sites, didn't fare better with crops. Comanche turned horses and captives into leverage, holding the plains until the game changed. The Comanche started picking up better guns from French colonists and fur traders in the Louisiana Territory around the 1730s. They rode into camps near Natchitoches, traded 50 buffalo hides, and walked away with smoothbore muskets, a step up from the old bows. They took to shooting fast, nailing targets at 100 yards within months, per French accounts from 1740. Those guns let them hit Spanish settlements hard, like the 1758 raid on Saba Mission, where 300 warriors looted a stockade, killed 19 settlers, and left the rest running, according to mission logs. Spain's troops tried to lock them down, but a 1779 march by Governor Juan Bautista de Anza with 600 men only slowed them for a season. Bravery mattered in Comanche camps, where a man's worth hung on his fight. Warriors earned respect through a trick called counting Coup, a habit shared with tribes like the Cheyenne. A rider would gallop within arm's reach of a Spanish soldier, tap him with a stick and peel off, leaving the man red-faced but alive. In a 1760 skirmish near the Red River, one Comanche brushed past 3 foes, in a row dodging musket balls, per a trader's journal. That took guts. One slip meant a blade in the ribs. The ones who pulled it off, or dropped enemies outright, stood out. A warrior with 5 coups in 1765 took 2 wives from a strong family, and led a band of 80 by 1770, tribal oral histories note. Skill and nerve shaped who rose and who didn't. Those guns and guts kept them free longer. Spain's forts, often 150 men light, couldn't hold. Muskets tipped the odds against Apache bows, too. Some say they over-relied on raids, but farming wouldn't have dodged the bullets. Either Saba's ashes prove it. The Comanche built a name that carried weight, and it paid off in wives and rank. The Comanche stuck together as a group with common goals, but their real power split into smaller chunks. Families tied by blood or marriage, usually 20 to 50 people, roamed the plains as tight units, hauling teepees across Texas grasslands. In 1751, 3 bands totaling 150 joined up near the Red River to raid a Spanish outpost per trader logs, then split off a month later when the loot ran dry. That flexibility kept them sharp. If a drought hit or enemies closed in, a band of 30 might break off and head west, leaving no trail. Family ties ran deep, and marriage locked you into the whole clan. A man eyeing a wife in 1760 didn't just court her. He faced her brothers, handing over 5 horses, and spending a week hauling buffalo meat to their camp, per oral histories. Most aimed for multiple wives, often sisters, like one warrior who wed 3 siblings by 1765, and ran a camp of 60. Single pairings happened too, and some women took 2 husbands, a setup noted in French records from 1749. Close kin marriages stayed off limits. No swollen jaws or weak bloodlines showed up in skeletal finds from Comanche sites. Unlike Europe's royal mess, no big ceremonies marked the deal. A man moved his gear into a teepee with his main wife, while her sister set up another 20 yards off, cooking over a separate fire. Splitting up was simple for him. He'd pack up and walk out. Done. For her, it took more. In 1770, a woman left her husband, ran to her brother's camp 10 miles north, and watched him square off with the ex, trading blows, until the man backed off, per tribal accounts. Or the brother might toss over 4 horses to settle it clean. That system leaned on kin, not courts, and kept things moving. Staying loose paid off. Bands dodged Spanish cavalry that bogged down chasing fixed towns. Some say tighter rules might have built stronger alliances, but evidence disagrees. Apache villages with rigid setups burned out by 1750. Comanche kept family at the core, and it held them steady through the chaos. The Comanche kept their spiritual life quiet. Some claimed a creator lived in the sun. Others insisted it stood alone, separate from the sky, according to traders jotting notes in Texas around 1755. Power ran thick across the plains and into the Rocky Mountains, a force they named Puha, something the Cheyenne and others tapped to. A woman in 1762 skinned a bison near the Red River, saw a flash overhead, called it the Thunderbird, and tucked a feather in her bundle, sure it carried weight. Wolves lingered near camps with a silent edge. Bears loomed large in sleep. Skunks stunk of caution. Possums slipped through traps. Cedar cleared the air. And peyote sharpened thoughts, each holding its own spark. Some Comanche grabbed that spark tight, turning into puhacatl, people marked by what they held. In 1775, a man eased a sick elder's cough after a bear brushed his tent, per tribal tales. Folks argued he'd picked it up from his uncle, or soaked it in himself. Young ones went looking for it. In 1768, a 16-year-old hiked 1,800 feet up a peak in the Wichita Mountains, skipped food for 4 days, and sat through 2 sleepless nights, waiting for a nod from above, per French logs. If it hit, a gust, a howl, he'd trek back, ready to fix a fever, or mend a limp, working alone or linking up with 15 others, in a medicine group by 1773 per early counts. That way fit the plains' pulse. Power didn't need walls or priests. Spain's missions locked in 400 converts by 1710, but Comanche sidestepped that net, keeping Puha close and practical. Some call it luck-driven, yet it patched wounds, while rigid creeds crumbled under raids. It flexed where it had to, and that's what counted. The Comanche picked their leaders through a straightforward vote. In 1755, 20 respected men from a band of 80 sat in a circle near the Red River, hashed out who'd lead, and settled on a 40-year-old who'd raided Spanish ranches 6 times, per trader notes. They looked for sharp skills, a steady voice others followed, and a knack for talking tough. That guy held the spot until 1759, when a botched hunt left half the camp hungry, and they swapped him out for a quieter hand. Every band did it their way, but the pattern stuck. Pick someone good, ditch them if they slipped. Most groups chose 2 heads. One ran the fights, barking orders in a 1762 clash that took 15 horses from a Taos outpost. The other kept the peace, settling a 1765 spat over a split buffalo haul. without blood per French logs. The peace chief usually called bigger shots, gathering with others in 1770 near the Wichita Mountains, 50 men strong, to argue over trading with the French or hitting them instead. They'd decide, but no one had to listen. In 1772, a young warrior shrugged off a call to raid Mexico, took his 10 kin north instead, and no one hauled him back. That loose setup tripped up outsiders. Spanish envoys in 1786 met a peace chief near San Antonio, inked a deal to stop attacks, then watched 30 Comanche hit a ranch 20 miles south 2 weeks later, per colonial reports. Freedom trumped orders, and it kept European plans scrambling. Fast forward, and they're still at it. By 2025, the Comanche Nation counts 15,000 per tribal rolls. Near Lawton, Oklahoma, a council of 9, elected every 4 years. Since 1969, sorts membership, runs federal grants, and keeps the lights on, sticking to the old habit of choosing who leads. That free streak held them together. Spain's top-down chains, buckled under raids by 1800. Some say tighter control might have built a stronger front, but 15,000 still standing in 2025 argue it worked fine. They bent, voted, and rolled on. Back when the Comanche ruled the plains in the 1700s, their language, Numutekwapu, rang out from Texas to Kansas. Traders in 1752 at a Wichita camp swapped horses with a Comanche band, barking orders in Numutekwapu to seal the deal, per French logs. It glued talks together across tribes like the Kiowa. That faded fast after 1875. U.S. agents herded 7,000 Comanche onto Oklahoma reservations by 1880, per census counts, and rolled out schools where kids caught English lessons, not their own tongue. By 1890, a 10-year-old at Fort Sill answered roll call in English, his parents muttering Numutekwapu at home, but he never picked it up. It didn't die out completely. In 1941, 17 Comanche men signed up for the U.S. Army, sat in a tent near Normandy in 1944, and whispered Numutekwapu into radios, passing troop coordinates, while German ears stayed clueless per military files. A sergeant handed them a coded page. They cracked it in 3 minutes flat, grinning as a machine team next door sweated 4 hours over the same lines. Those code talkers, trained at Fort Benning in 1941, turned a fading language into a weapon, sending 200 messages during D-Day alone, per Army reports. English smothered Numutekwapu, but war flipped the script. Some argue the U.S. killed it on purpose. 80% of Comanche kids spoke only English by 1900, per surveys. Yet those 17 proved it still had teeth. Forcing it out left gaps machines couldn't fill. A dead language outran tech in a pinch. The Comanche language, Numutekwapu, teetered on the edge by 1900, with only 20% of kids speaking it, per tribal surveys. Elders in 1990 sat at a table in Lawton, Oklahoma, flipping through old notebooks, piecing together words their grandkids barely knew. By 2000, the Comanche Nation printed 500 language books and mailed tapes to 3,000 homes per council records. A clerk at the office brushed off a guy asking for a tattoo translation with a quick shake of the head. It's tough going. Half the fluent speakers died off between 1980 and 2010, leaving 50 by 2025 per enrollment stats. But they're holding the line. The pushback started earlier. After 1865, the U.S. government, flush with post-Civil War cash, turned west. In 1874, 3,000 troops hit the plains, torched 1,400 Comanche horses at Palo Duro Canyon, and marched 7,200 people onto an Oklahoma reservation, with the Kiowa and Apache by June 1875, per Army logs. That land split in 1901, each family got 160 acres, and settlers snapped up 480,000 surplus acres by 1906, per federal deeds. A joint Kiowa-Comanche-Apache committee ran things from 1936, meeting in Anadarko to divvy up funds until 1969, when 300 Comanche voted in a new constitution and split off per tribal minutes. Now, nearly 15,000 carry Comanche enrollment cards in 2025, per official counts. Near Lawton, a council of 9 elected since 1970 hands out housing grants and runs a museum, keeping the old ways breathing. Spain crushed Pueblo towns by 1700, but this crew dodged that fate. Some say reservations broke them, yet 15,000 in a flag snapping over Oklahoma say otherwise. They call it Lords of the Southern Plains, and it still fits.